NATO now openly talks about the possibility of preemptive action against Russia. That's not a stray comment from some junior bureaucrat or a misquote from years ago. It is coming from a senior figure within the alliance, an Italian admiral who chairs NATO's military committee. He has publicly suggested that NATO may need to consider more aggressive measures against Moscow in response to what he calls a series of hybrid attacks on Europe, drone incursions, cyber operations, train derailments in Poland, mysterious fires at factories in Germany, and even incidents in the United States. We're told, as usual, that all of this just appears out of nowhere, that Russia, without any antecedent, simply woke up and decided to attack Europe through hybrid means. The implication is that NATO is a passive victim and is now reluctantly considering preemptive action in order to deter Moscow. But for years, the West has proudly advertised the fact that more than 50 countries are supporting Ukraine's war effort against Russia. They have supplied lethal weapons, ammunition, training, targeting intelligence, long-range fires, and every conceivable tool of modern warfare designed specifically to kill Russian soldiers on the battlefield. Western leaders brag about this openly. You can dislike Russia. You can say you support Ukraine and consider it morally justified to pour in weapons. That is a policy choice, and people can debate it. But what you cannot do, at least not honestly, is pretend that you can arm Ukraine to kill Russians at scale and then declare that Russia has no right to respond. The underlying message from NATO is, we can help kill your soldiers, but you must simply accept it. If you react in any way, we will accuse you of aggression and consider taking P. From Moscow's point of view, it is perfectly logical to mirror the West's thinking. Russian officials can say, we are tired of you supporting Ukrainian operations that strike our troops and our territory. We will impose a cost on your behavior. That is precisely how deterrence is supposed to work. Yet the Europeans and the broader Western establishment keep doubling down, assuming that what has utterly failed to deter Russia for 4 years will somehow start working now. The record is clear. Escalation of Western involvement has not broken Russia's will or capability. It has only deepened Moscow's resolve. The danger is obvious. If NATO moves from providing weapons and targeting intelligence to taking direct kinetic action striking Russian infrastructure, for instance, that would be a qualitative escalation. The Admiral's language about preemptive action leaves that door open. Whether it's a tit-for-tat sabotage operation or something more overt, it pushes us closer to a direct NATO-Russia confrontation. And that, given the nuclear realities, is catastrophic territory. All of this is happening while the stated goal, at least on paper, is to find a way to end the war. In practice, however, NATO's posture is not aimed at ending the war. It is aimed at maintaining Western prestige and pretending that Russia can be coerced into accepting defeat. That is not going to happen. On the diplomatic front, Volodymyr Zelensky traveled to Paris to meet Emmanuel Macron, seeking more support, military, political, psychological. Macron repeated his familiar refrain, Europe must provide security guarantees for Ukraine. He insists that only Ukraine can decide questions of territory, that frozen Russian assets should be used by the EU, and that Ukraine's fate is tightly bound to Europe's security. That might sound impressive on television, but in Moscow, and frankly, for anyone who looks at the military balance honestly, it's empty theater. France's entire active armed forces number somewhere around 180,000, 200,000 personnel, including all logistics, support, intelligence, artillery, armor, air, and naval components. The actual number of deployable combat troops is much smaller, and for nearly 4 years, Paris has refused to send French soldiers directly into the war against Russia. On what rational basis are we supposed to believe that years from now, France will suddenly decide to risk a direct war with Moscow for Ukraine when it won't do so today? The French public is not clamoring to send their sons and daughters to die in Donbass. Most Europeans understand on some level that this is fundamentally a conflict between Russia and Ukraine that was turned into a proxy war only because NATO decided to insert itself ever deeper into Ukraine's internal affairs. Crucially, before 2014, before the Maidan coup, before the Minsk agreements were sabotaged, before NATO expansion into Ukraine was pressed forward, there was no serious suggestion that Russia intended to invade Western Europe. None. Yet now, Baltic and European leaders throw around claims that Russia has invaded 19 countries in the last 100 years, conflating the Soviet campaign against Nazi Germany in World War II with modern Russia's actions, and rebranding every Russian military move as unprovoked aggression. In the Russian view, the conflicts in Georgia 2008 and Ukraine 2014 onward, culminating in 2022, were responses to hostile moves by NATO-linked regimes. In Georgia, it was Tbilisi under President Saakashvili that started the war in 2008 by attacking South Ossetia, where Russian peacekeepers were stationed. Russia responded, neutralized the Georgian forces, and recognized the breakaway regions. It did not, however, conquer the whole of Georgia, although it easily could have. Moscow took just enough action to protect its people and then stopped. If it had wanted territorial conquest, the outcome would have looked very different. The same pattern held in Ukraine after 2014. Russia provided limited support to Russian-speaking populations in Donbass, but there was no full-scale invasion for 8 years. Moscow repeatedly sought a diplomatic solution via the Minsk Accords. It was only when NATO kept pushing eastward, openly talking about bringing Ukraine into the alliance despite explicit public Russian warnings, that Moscow launched the special military operation in 2022. That operation, whatever one chooses to call it, was the predictable outcome of Western refusal to recognize Russia's red lines and security concerns. If we ignore all of this context and insist that Russia is the aggressor while writing out NATO's role, we simply guarantee that this war will drag on and that another conflict will follow. Real peace requires acknowledgement of reality, the balance of power, the legitimacy of Russian security concerns, and the need for a stable European order that does not treat Russia as a permanent enemy. Instead, we get European commentators, like those on France 24, arguing that Europe must be present in Ukraine because the United States may waver and Europe has more to lose if Russia gains ground. The implication is that Europe must show it is a force to be reckoned with by clinging blindly to a losing strategy. But this isn't about whether Washington moves closer to Russia or Ukraine. It's about whether anyone in the West is willing to acknowledge the basic military and political reality. Russia holds the initiative, has the industrial base and manpower needed to sustain a war of attrition, and has restructured its economy for long-term conflict. Policy must be based on what is, not on fantasies about what Western elites wish were true. In time, a wise diplomacy can shape reality in a better direction, but only if it starts from facts on the ground. Denial of those facts leads not just to failure, but to potentially catastrophic failure. Russia, meanwhile, is not ignoring these threats from NATO. Maria Zakharova, speaking for the Russian Foreign Ministry, has already responded to the admiral's talk of preemptive strikes. She called such statements extremely irresponsible, underscoring that they show the alliance's readiness to move toward escalation rather than de-escalation. She made it clear that Moscow sees this rhetoric as a deliberate attempt to undermine efforts to settle the Ukrainian conflict. And she warned that those who speak this way must understand the risks and possible consequences, including for NATO member states themselves. What she is signaling quite plainly is that Russia means what it says. For years, Moscow warned that moving NATO into Ukraine and ignoring Russian security concerns would lead to war. The Bucharest summit in 2008, where NATO declared that Georgia and Ukraine will become members, was a clear turning point. Russia responded that this was unacceptable. In 2008, when Georgia attacked South Ossetia, Russia intervened decisively. In 2021, Russian officials warned that if the West continued to press Ukraine's NATO path and arm Kiev to the teeth, Russia would resort to military technical measures. In February 2022, that is exactly what happened. Zakharova's message is, if NATO now talks about preemptive strikes on Russia itself, Moscow will not shrug it off as mere rhetoric forever. At some point, words and threats begin to shape the strategic environment, and Russia will adjust accordingly. If NATO escalates further, Russia reserves the right to respond not only in Ukraine, but against the alliance's own assets, if necessary. To assume that Russia doesn't really mean it is reckless. Moscow has already shown that it does what it says it will do when pushed to a certain point. For the moment, the hope is that this remains just talk, that NATO's leadership is bluffing for domestic consumption rather than preparing actual strikes. So far, it has not crossed that line. But the language is trending in a dangerous direction, and Russia is clearly taking note. Parallel to this, there is supposedly a push for peace talks. Yet many of the same people who claim to want peace are actively undermining any possible diplomatic track. In the United States, Steve Whitty, the key American negotiator reportedly involved in back-channel contacts, is being denounced as a traitor and targeted for removal after leaks, suggesting that he was discussing possible frameworks for a deal with the Kremlin, even allegedly advising how to structure language for talks with Trump. The goal of those attacks is obvious: to kill any peace initiative that might recognize Russian gains or Russian security interests. Dmitry Peskov, Putin's spokesman, has been asked about these leaks. His response highlighted, quite pointedly, the lack of credibility of Western media outlets. Bloomberg included, accusing them of exaggeration and spreading half-truths. It's hard to argue otherwise, given how Western media has behaved throughout this conflict. Their posture has been less journalism, more propaganda, and it is not only in Washington that there is resistance to peace. Macron's constant talk of security guarantees for Ukraine, coupled with his insistence that only Kyiv can decide territorial questions, flies directly in the face of Russia's stated red lines. Moscow has annexed 4 regions, Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson, into the Russian Federation and written this into its constitution. Putin has stated unambiguously that the objectives of the special military operation will be fully achieved. That includes control of all the administrative territory of those 4 regions. For him to agree to anything less would require revising the Russian constitution, abandoning Russian citizens on the wrong side of a new line of contact, and essentially admitting defeat despite having the advantage on the battlefield. Politically, that is impossible. So when Macron says only Ukraine can decide about land, he is ignoring the reality that Russia also has a say through force of arms and through constitutional acts that Moscow is not going to reverse. Russia has the combat power to compel Kiev to accept its terms in the end. If Western leaders refuse to internalize this, they do not just sabotage negotiations. They guarantee that the war will continue until Russia enforces its position on the ground and over the ruins of much of Ukraine. If Washington pushes Witta out and abandons even the modest moves toward a settlement, the peace process will be further crippled. Who would replace him? The Secretary of State, perhaps, in theory. But the current State Department leadership has shown no interest in serious diplomacy on Ukraine. Trump, for his part, faces strong headwinds from within the U.S. establishment, which is full of people who would rather see the war continue than admit that Russia has won the strategic contest. Meanwhile, Russia keeps repeating the same basic message. We are ready for negotiations, but if we do not get an agreement that reflects the realities on the ground and our core security requirements, we are prepared to fight on. After nearly 4 years of war, Russia has shifted its economy, finances, and politics onto a war footing. The Russian public is being asked to tighten its belt to ensure victory, and judging by Putin's approval ratings and the tone of Russian media, a very large majority accepts this. Russian newspapers and commentators are increasingly blunt. They argue that the West is responsible for the war in Ukraine, for undermining what it likes to call the rules-based international order, and for forcing Russia to build a new European security architecture from a position of strength. One recent analysis essentially says Russia has the staying power the West lacks. If necessary, Russia will fight until Kyiv and the Western-sponsored order that backed it collapse, and then Moscow will help shape a new order atop those ruins. That is how Russians see it. And They trust Putin because he says openly what they believe and then acts accordingly. It is not mere rhetoric. If you compare the line of contact when many of these Western commentary channels started covering the war to the line today, you'll see that it has consistently moved westward. You can complain that Russian advances are slow, but that complaint ignores the vast scale of Ukrainian casualties and the reality that this is a grinding war of attrition, not a blitzkrieg. November just passed is reported to have been the worst month for Ukraine in terms of losses since the war began. The trend is unmistakable. Russia is advancing, not retreating. Against this backdrop, we now have the debate around the so-called 28-point and 19-point peace plans. The 28-point plan was leaked almost certainly by people opposed to peace precisely so they could brand it as a Russian plan and attack anyone associated with it. Critics like Professor Michael Clark describe it as a surrender document written effectively by Russia. According to this narrative, the Russians are allegedly clinging to this 28-point framework, while Ukraine, backed by Europe, has a more reasonable 19-point proposal. The United States, we're told, must somehow reconcile the Ukrainian plan with the Russian plan. But if you actually look at the content of the 28 points, that description is absurd. There are certainly provisions that Russia can live with Putin, and Russian officials have said as much. That is why Moscow has indicated that it could serve as a basis for negotiation. But there are at least 4 major points in that document that Russia categorically rejects and has said so repeatedly. First, point 6 reportedly envisions a future Ukrainian armed force of 600,000 troops. Moscow has indicated that it might tolerate something on the order of 85,000 from the Russian perspective, allowing a 6-fold larger army backed by NATO-trained officers sitting right across the border after all that has happened is simply unacceptable. No serious Russian decision maker is going to accept that. Second point 10 involves extensive U.S. security guarantees for Ukraine commitments that would, in effect, give Washington a pretext to go to war with Russia if conflict flared again. Why exactly would Russia accept that when today there are no such guarantees and Moscow is clearly winning the war of attrition? That would be a step backward from Russia's current position, not forward. It makes no sense for Moscow. Third, point 14 proposes using frozen Russian assets on the order of $100 billion to rebuild Ukraine. Think about that for a moment. We are told that this is a Russian plan, but in this supposed Russian plan, Moscow agrees to pay enormous reparations to the side it is defeating. You don't need a PhD in international relations to see the absurdity. No victor in a major war voluntarily writes into a treaty that it will pay a gigantic indemnity to its defeated adversary. The only people who could describe such a document as Russian authored are those who have not actually read it or who are lying about it for propaganda purposes. Fourth, point 21 reportedly requires Russia to give up portions of Zaporozhye and Kherson territories that Russia has already declared part of the Russian Federation, with that status enshrined in its constitution. For Putin to accept such a provision, he would have to go back to the Duma, amend the constitution, and tell the Russian public and armed forces, we are abandoning millions of our newly recognized citizens to the whims of a hostile Ukrainian state. Politically, that would be suicidal. The military, the security services, key elites, and the broader Russian public would not tolerate it. That single concession would probably be more destabilizing domestically than losing $100 billion in assets. So no, the 28-point plan is not some Russian diktat that hands everything to Moscow. It contains elements that Russia can live with and major concessions that Russia cannot accept. That is precisely why Moscow describes it only as a basis for discussion, not a final agreement. The fact that Western commentators call it Russian only shows that they either haven't read it or are deliberately mischaracterizing it. If the 28 points already include multiple provisions that Russia cannot accept, imagine what the unknown 19-point Ukrainian version looks like. We haven't seen it likely because if it were published, it would be obvious that it is even more out of line with Russian realities and red lines. So those who oppose peace are trying to fix the narrative. Our plan reasonable, Russia's plan outrageous, except the texts don't support that. All the while, the war continues not only on land but at sea. Ukraine has recently begun using naval drones to attack the so-called Shadow Fleet civilian tankers carrying Russian oil in international waters or in foreign ports. These are not Russian Navy warships, they are civilian commercial vessels, sometimes not even sailing under the Russian flag. Under any sane reading of international law, these attacks are acts of war against civilian targets. There is ongoing debate about how much Western intelligence and operational support is behind these strikes, but it is difficult to believe that Ukraine is doing this entirely on its own. So far, 3 ships have reportedly been hit, given that estimates of the total fleet range from 900 to 1,300 vessels. This is a small percentage, but here again, Russia is highly unlikely to let it slide. Moscow has shown from the beginning that it responds to provocations and generally hits back harder than it was hit. Russian social media and pro-government channels are already boiling with anger over these attacks and NATO's preemptive strike rhetoric. One widespread sentiment is, if you attack our civilian shipping and talk about striking us preemptively, we now have every justification to take Odessa, cut off Ukraine's Black Sea access, and remove the threat at its source. That doesn't mean the Kremlin has adopted that as an official policy, at least not yet. But you can be sure that Russia's general staff is gaming out such options. There is zero chance that Moscow will passively accept repeated strikes on its civilian oil fleet without consequences. The entire pattern of this war has been the West escalates, Russia responds, and Russia's response is more effective than what the West did. Yet Western elites still tell themselves that pushing further will somehow produce a different outcome. As someone who comes out of the Western system, I find it embarrassing to watch my own governments behave this way. We are acting as if Russia is a minor regional power that can be bullied with rhetoric and sanctions, when in reality Russia has the industrial capacity, manpower, and political will to sustain this war for as long as it takes. It has reorganized its economy for wartime production. It is building ammunition, drones, missiles, and armor at rates that Ukraine and NATO cannot match without setting their own economies on a full war footing which their populations are not prepared to accept. At this point, the only thing that can halt Russia's advance is a sober decision in Western capitals to recognize reality and negotiate a settlement based on that reality. Russia has repeatedly said that it remains open to negotiations. Putin himself has stated again that Russia prefers a negotiated solution that secures its objectives. The question is not whether Moscow is willing to talk. The question is whether anyone in Washington, Brussels, Berlin, or Paris is willing to face the facts. And here is the cruel truth that almost nobody in the Western mainstream is willing to say aloud. Those who are trying to sabotage the peace process, whether in Europe or in the United States, are not defending Ukraine's security. They are guaranteeing Ukraine's destruction. Every day that the war continues, more Ukrainians die, both at the front and in the rear, under long-range Russian strikes. Every additional month of conflict depletes what remains of Ukraine's infrastructure, industry, and demographic future. If the war stopped tomorrow because an agreement was signed, the dying would stop almost immediately. If the war drags on for another year or more, because Western politicians and media figures don't want to admit that Russia has won, then tens of thousands more Ukrainians will die for nothing. That logic is not lost on Russians. In Moscow, the view is that the only path that preserves any meaningful future for Ukraine is the one Russia is proposing. A settlement that recognizes territorial realities, neutralizes Ukraine militarily, and builds a new security framework in Europe that takes Russia's interests into account. Ironically, from Moscow's perspective, the Russian path is the path that saves the most Ukrainian lives. It is Western policy dressed up in the language of solidarity and democracy that is condemning Ukraine to further bloodshed. Russia also hasn't forgotten the pattern of Western betrayal. The Minsk Accords, which Western leaders later admitted were never meant to be implemented, but only to buy time to arm Ukraine. The 21st of February 2014 agreement that was supposed to lead to elections in Ukraine, sabotaged by a U.S.-backed regime change operation that handpicked a new government in Kyiv. The repeated assurances given and broken, followed by accusations that only Russia violates agreements. The hypocrisy is staggering. Given that record, one has to ask, even if a paper agreement is reached, why would Moscow trust the West to honor it? It may be that some of Russia's willingness to talk is about signaling to the global South and non-Western world. We are the responsible actor. We are willing to negotiate. It is the West that refuses. That message plays well in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, where memories of Western interventions and broken promises are long. In the end, the West faces a simple choice. It can either continue down the current path, denying reality, escalating rhetoric, flirting with direct confrontation, and feeding Ukraine into a meat grinder, or it can accept that Russia has prevailed in this contest and work out a new security arrangement that respects that fact. The first path means no stability, no peace, and the near total ruin of Ukraine as a functioning state. The second path at least offers a chance for a stable, if cold, peace, and the possibility that, over time, relations can be normalized. Right now, Western elites seem intent on choosing the first path. They talk about security guarantees for Ukraine, while ignoring that they cannot guarantee anything against a Russia that holds the strategic upper hand. They threaten preemptive strikes, while Russia warns, quite credibly, that escalation will not be one-sided. They denounce peace plans as Russian propaganda without even reading them. And they wrap all of this in moralistic rhetoric about defending democracy, when the real effect of their policies is to sacrifice Ukrainians on the altar of Western prestige. The first and primary victim of this insanity is Ukraine itself. Its population has been decimated, its economy shattered, its young men slaughtered on the front lines, its future mortgaged for generations. Whether Ukraine can ever fully recover is an open question. But if there is to be any hope at all, then the war must end, and it must end on terms that reflect the reality that Russia is not going away, is not going to be defeated, and is not going to surrender its gains. Until Western leaders accept that, there will be no peace and no stability, only more destruction, more death, and more opportunities for Russia to demonstrate again and again that it holds the stronger hand.